小心列車與台間之空隙，請小心列車與月台之間的空隙。Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
Thank you for tuning into Haldanes Law Matters, a podcast where we have conversations about legal developments in Hong Kong. This podcast is brought to you by Haldanes, a Hong Kong-based law firm experienced in serving the needs of clients, both in Hong Kong and throughout the Asia Pacific. Established in 1975, the lawyers of Haldanes have an extensive collective knowledge of legal practice in the region. The firm has a strong reputation across all of its practice areas, and its excellence has been acknowledged by various awards bodies.
Joining me in this episode today is Willard Li, partner at Haldanes in Hong Kong. Welcome to the show, Willard.
Thank you, Stephen. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Before we start, Willard, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your practice.
So I'm a partner in the matrimonial law practice at Haldanes. We have a fairly sizable matrimonial law practice, and we specialize in this area. So my practice mainly consists of advising clients and representing them in divorce proceedings, in disputes ranging from financial disputes and disputes regarding arrangements for children and most other things involved in the process.
Well, as I said, it's great to have you on. This episode, we'll be talking about grounds for divorce. It sounds pretty obvious to people, but it's quite technical, I believe. First of all, there's a fault and no fault divorce. Can you just explain to us the grounds of fault and no fault to someone like me who's not a lawyer?
Right. Well, technically in Hong Kong, there is only one ground of divorce, and that would be irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. However, that's divided into 5 facts, we call them, 5 reasons for the divorce. We loosely refer to these as the divorce grounds. So as to fault-based divorce, that would be grounds of divorce such as adultery or unreasonable behaviour. No fault would be grounds of divorce based on separation. So that could be 1 year of separation, which would require the other party's consent, or 2 years of separation, where a person can petition for divorce and it does not require the consent of the opposite party.
Right. So fault is if you're having an affair or you in an abusive relationship or sort of in that ballpark, and then for no fault is just natural separation and kind of natural progression that'll become a no fault grounds. Would that be a fair summary?
Yes, that's right. So for fault-based, adultery is fairly obvious what that is. But if you want the technical explanation, it's where one party has committed adultery and had voluntary sexual intercourse to a person he or she is not married to, and the person petitioning for divorce finds it intolerable to live with this person any longer. This is more rare in our experience because it could be difficult for the petitioner to prove adultery, which is required. Unreasonable behavior is the other ground. So unreasonable behavior is where the person, we'll call them the respondent, has behaved in such a way that the person petitioning for the divorce can no longer be expected to live with him or her. So this is more of a blanket ground where it can cover adultery, for example, and it would be easier to prove under the ground of unreasonable behavior. It could also be various things, such as one party wanting children or not wanting children, or various other aspects of behavior where 2 people have, a conflict in the relationship.
I've been speaking to some of your other colleagues on the other episodes, and a couple of things that have come up. One is like obviously divorce is very emotional, and things happen during the process. And the other thing that sort of came through was it's obvious that courts have to make very difficult decisions. So when the courts are presented fault and no fault grounds, how do they typically view these matters?
The court always wants to see the parties resolve whatever conflict they have in their divorce, the chief of which being the ground of divorce itself. Now, a lot of people, since divorce is a very emotional thing, they may begin the proceedings on the basis of unreasonable behavior because they're very aggrieved by the behavior of the other person. But as time goes on in the proceedings and they realize there are a lot of other things that need to be resolved, such as arrangements for their children, if they have children, or financial matters, they may amend the divorce petition and agree to proceed on a no-fault basis, such as 1 year of separation. I think in many cases, it's not very sensible to have a contested divorce on the basis of unreasonable behavior, because the divorce suit itself, the battle over that, will consume a lot of time and a lot of money, when that could be better deployed to resolve the other disputes which arise from the divorce.
Again, the theme is the courts want things to be resolved amicably, right? So that sounds pretty consistent. I mentioned again in another episode that Hong Kong's a very international city. We've got many foreigners living in Hong Kong. How does it work for foreigners wanting to get divorced in the city?
Right. So foreigners can get divorced in Hong Kong. That's the short answer to the question. There are a couple of requirements, though. First, the marriage must be valid. What I mean by that is that the marriage must be valid according to the law of the place where the marriage took place. And the marriage must also be valid under the Hong Kong law definition of a marriage, which is a voluntary union for life of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others. So while there are other jurisdictions in the world which would recognize same-sex marriage, unfortunately, you would not be able to get a divorce in Hong Kong on the basis of a same-sex marriage at the current time. Another consideration as to whether foreigners can divorce in Hong Kong is whether they would satisfy the jurisdictional test under Hong Kong law. So naturally, the Hong Kong court will only take up jurisdiction over the marriage and grant a divorce if there is a link between these parties and the jurisdiction of Hong Kong. So we would consider whether they would satisfy the test of 3 years of habitual residence in Hong Kong prior to applying for the divorce, or if they haven't lived in Hong Kong for 3 years yet at the point of the divorce, the court would consider whether they have a substantial connection to Hong Kong. And that can cover a number of different factors, such as whether the parties work in Hong Kong, whether they have businesses here, whether they own assets here, whether they've had children here, whether they have children who go to school in Hong Kong, or other factors linking their lives to Hong Kong.
So Hong Kong's not quite there yet on the same-sex marriage. Aside from the same-sex marriage side, it sounds like it's quite technical. There's a lot of technical reasonings behind foreigners getting divorced in Hong Kong. In reality, is it quite common in Hong Kong for those things to happen?
Yeah, it's quite common, and we have a number of expatriate clients who come to us for divorce proceedings. As you can understand, Hong Kong is a very international city, and we have many people here from all over the world. So it's quite common that we have foreigners seeking divorce in Hong Kong. And you're right in that it is very technical, because the Hong Kong court is very sensitive about jurisdiction. So a lot of times when we have foreigners applying for a divorce in Hong Kong, the court may raise requisitions to ask the petitioner to prove either their habitual residence or their substantial connection. And in that case, we have to build the case to explain to the court, to demonstrate the connection of these people to this place. And sometimes we do come across cases where the court declines to accept jurisdiction, and that creates additional difficulties.
The next question is really about how does adultery affect divorce? Now, you mentioned obviously extramarital affairs is counted as a fault on the grounds, and you also mentioned that courts try to move that to a no fault. But what if it doesn't? And then so how does that affect the case if adultery has been committed and it is firmly on the line of fault?
So the greatest impact adultery would have on a divorce would be increasing the animosity in the divorce proceedings. So in divorce proceedings, there are three main things that need to be resolved. One, the divorce suit, which is the cause of the divorce itself. The second, if there are children, the arrangements for the children. And then thirdly, there have to be financial issues which need to be resolved. So if the divorce proceeds on the basis of adultery and becomes highly contested, then that has a knock-on effect to the other topics that need to be resolved within a divorce. So if the level of contention, the level of animosity is at a high level, then that could lead to increased disputes in the other categories. But in terms of financial division, adultery should not have an impact on that. The only aspects of behavior, so to speak, which would affect those things would be if there is financial misconduct, or in terms of the children's arrangements, if there has been any misbehavior on either party when it came to the children.
Please correct me if I'm wrong here, but to me it doesn't seem to make sense to proceed a divorce on the basis of adultery, because it just seems that no one wins, especially if you have children, right? You mentioned that you're just dialing up the animosity towards each other, and then everything else, as you said, escalates. But it still happens, though, right? Is it quite common to have divorce based on adultery in the city?
It's very common for divorces to begin on the basis of unreasonable behavior more than adultery, because, well, first of all, adultery is difficult to prove. So you can cite adultery as a ground under unreasonable behavior and proceed on that basis. But to answer, the core of your question is whether people do still proceed on the basis of a fault-based divorce. Yes, we see that quite often because divorce is a very emotional thing. It leads from a breakdown of a relationship. So in very many cases, the person seeking the divorce is very aggrieved. They want to be right. They want to win the divorce, so to speak. Really, in a divorce, it's not really a question of winning or losing. It's the focus is more on the breakdown of a relationship and what the parties need to do to move forward with their lives and put their lives back into order. So we usually would discourage parties to proceed on a fault basis. And if at all possible, it's best to proceed on the basis of separation. But one of the technical considerations is that if you proceed on a no-fault separation basis, you must be separated for at least 1 year. So sometimes we have situations where they will proceed on the basis of unreasonable behavior, which has no timing requirement, but proceed on the basis of mild particulars of unreasonable behavior. So instead of alleging all the various misconducts of a party in a divorce, we would have particulars of the unreasonable behavior being things such as loss of love and affection, inability to communicate, or having grown apart, something which is more neutral, even though technically it's still a fault-based divorce ground.
So you're trying to dial it down, basically.
Exactly. Dial it down so we can get the divorce proceeding started immediately rather than waiting 1 year.
Makes sense. And with that, that's all the time we have for this episode, Willard. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And listeners, thank you for listening. And I look forward to talking to you on our next episode.
请勿靠近車門，請不要靠近車門。Please stand back from the doors.
Thank you again for tuning in. And to find out more about Haldanes, please visit www.haldanes.com.